Well, hi sisters, it's good to be with you today, and I'm excited to teach a lesson for you like I always do when I come to Brazil. And this week's lesson is going to be called Grace and Gratitude, and we're going to learn some things from the Apostle Paul, Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 27. Kind of a difficult few verses, but I think there's some really rich truths in it for us. And I wanted to start with a little story, something maybe you have never heard me tell before, about my very first trip to Brazil. And it was an interesting one way back in 2011 when our family first started coming to Brazil. And it was the first time we took all of our 5 kids. And so we started in our little town in North Dakota, and so it was going to be a long, long trip. And if I remember correctly, so there were 7 of us, and if I remember correctly, we left about midnight and we drove about 4 hours to the biggest airport in our state and to get on the early morning flight. And from there we went to Chicago. From there we took another flight to JFK Airport in New York City, or in New York, and then down to Miami to finally get on the international flight to go to Rio de Janeiro. And so we had traveled for many, many hours already with our kids, even before we got to our international flight. And if you remember, their ages at that time, I think were around like 4, 6, 9, 11, and 13, right around that age. So they weren't babies or tiny, but they were young, and so it was definitely a big feat to get them all on these flights and stuff. And when we finally got to Brazil, we arrived in Rio de Janeiro and we started the process of getting through customs. And you have to remember that at that time, we did not speak any Portuguese. So we didn't understand any Portuguese and we couldn't say anything in Portuguese. And all of a sudden, I'm going to switch that over. All of a sudden, Brad was pulled aside in customs. And he had a suitcase with a whole bunch of eyeglasses in it because of course he's an optometrist and he comes down here to help take care of all the kids' eyes. And so he got pulled aside and I started to think, oh boy, what's happening? And so I just worked getting the kids through and everything, and we all got through customs and everything was okay. And I looked at him and he said, they're not letting me leave. They're keeping me here. I'm not sure why, but I'm not gonna get to leave until they say. So go ahead, go upstairs, get on the flight, or get checked in for the flight, and I'll try to get up there as soon as I can. Well, what ended up happening is they didn't release him in time. We had to book a second flight, and so it was very stressful. A lot of just wondering, why is this all happening? This is so crazy. We had everything set up. We worked so hard to get all the travel plans in order, and then to miss our flight and not really know how to navigate while we waited with the kids. It was just a lot of difficulty. And all that to say, by the time we got to Brazil, by the time we got to Chain of Love, I think we had been traveling about 24 hours total with our 5 kids. And on top of that, all the little girls' clothing was lost. Their luggage never did make it. So many obstacles, so much waiting, and wow, were we even supposed to be doing this? And these were some of the questions we asked. Did we not hear God correctly when we thought he was calling us to go and serve in Brazil? Why is this all seeming so difficult just on our first time out? But here we are 10 years later. Our roll-up Chain of Love has grown even more than we could have ever imagined. But there have been times like that day in the airport, waiting and wondering what God was doing and why was this so difficult and so hard. And these times of not understanding and not being able to do anything about it. And so we felt lost, but what we're going to find out in this message is that we were not forgotten by God. So let's take a quick look at the verses we're going to talk about today, Romans 11:25 to 27. And I'll read those quick. So that you will not be conceited, brothers, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. A partial hardening has come to Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the liberator will come from Zion. He will turn away godlessness from Jacob. and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And so we're going to look a little bit at these verses and see what we may have a little bit in common with Israel, and what maybe kind of God was doing. And Paul certainly felt that it needed to be explained because he called it a mystery. He said that so that you don't grow conceited or boastful, I want to reveal something to you about salvation. So just because Israel has rejected the gospel for the most part, this does not give the Gentiles the upper hand. And that was what Paul was really trying to show, was that if we look at that verse again, if we look at that first verse, verse 25, so that you won't be conceited, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery. And the mystery is this: a partial hardening has come to Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so Israel was going to be put on hold, and the Gentiles were going to have the opportunity to receive salvation. But Paul was trying to make it very clear here. This did not mean that the Gentiles had the upper hand and that they could be boastful and start to sort of take their salvation for granted. And I think that's important, and that what he's going to show us in these verses too is that even though Israel was hardened for a time, that God was always had a great purpose in what he was doing, and he was always in the process of fulfilling every promise that he had made, that God is faithful and he doesn't make promises and then change his mind and not keep them. And so Paul knew that this was going to be a mystery, and kind of like how we were in that airport, like, what's going on? I don't understand. Why is this happening? And so it's difficult to understand why God would put sort of a silencing on Israel, kind of a blinding, in order that Gentiles would be saved. But God can still be trusted, even if it seems like kind of a complicated plan, or a plan of, have you forgotten Israel? Have you forgotten that Israel is your chosen people? Have you forgotten the promises you've made to them? And so I think one thing that's important as we move through these verses to explain is who is Israel? And is all Israel, when God says all Israel will be saved, does that mean every Jew that ever lived at any time in history? And no, it doesn't. It does not necessarily mean every Jew. It means the remnant of Israel. And it refers to a representation of Israel at a given point in time. And what that shows is that God hasn't turned his back on Israel. He has made an entry point, a grafting in process available to the Gentiles. And he talks about that in chapter 11 and in chapter 10 even. And so this sort of blinding that is inflicted on the Jewish nation is really because of their inability to accept the gospel. It didn't arrive, the Messiah didn't arrive as they thought he should or would. And so they decided that they were going to continue to try to earn their salvation based on their good works. And we can look at a couple verses that help us to understand what he's saying here. And we look at Isaiah 29:10. And it says, "For the Lord has poured out on you an overwhelming urge to sleep. He has shut your eyes, the prophets, and covered your heads, the seers." And also Deuteronomy 29:4. So you see that God is doing exactly what he said he would do. He's not mad at Israel. He's simply responding to their disobedience. 29:4. "Yet to this day the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, eyes to see, or ears to hear." So this is Israel's problem, is their hearts have been hardened, and God is putting them on hold, and he is accepting the salvation and giving salvation to the Gentiles. And so Israel's problem was that they wouldn't accept the gospel by grace alone. Again, they wanted to do it themselves, and that was their problem in not being able to receive the gospel. They wanted God to look like what they wanted it to look like. And sometimes that's how we are. We want God's plan and the way he's going to do things to look the way we expect it to. And if it doesn't, then we start to think that maybe he's forgotten us. And Israel thought that too. This same gospel that God had made available to the Gentiles was available to Israel as well, but they wouldn't accept it. And what was really important to Paul here was that the Gentiles needed to know that God had not turned his back on Israel. And by giving them opportunity to receive salvation did not mean that God had changed his mind about them or did not love them and would not keep his promises to them. So God was showing his proven character. God was showing that he was a keeper of his promises, and it was important for Paul to make note of that the God of the New Testament, that the God of the New Covenant is the same God that is the God of Israel. And so God did not panic. He wasn't making a new plan at the last minute. He was simply fulfilling everything that he had already said he was going to do, which was that Israel was going to be blind for a time and have hard hearts for a time. So if we look then at verse 26, we go back to Romans chapter 11 and look at verse 26. It says, in this way all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the liberator will come from Zion, and he will turn away godlessness from Jacob. And so this is not saying all Israel as in every Israelite who ever lived, every Jew who ever lived, but this is Israel, the chosen Israel, those who will accept will be saved. And so let's look at Isaiah 59, 20 to 21. Okay. The Redeemer will come to Zion and to those in Jacob who turn from transgression. This is the Lord's declaration. As for me, this is my covenant with them, says the Lord. My spirit who is on you, and my words that I put in your mouth will not depart from your mouth, or from the mouth of your children, or from the mouth of your children's children, from now on forevermore. And so prophecy has been fulfilled here. And so we can count on that. And when Paul is talking to them here in this, he is really letting them know exactly that it's prophecy fulfilled, that its promises kept. And we're going to look again at a couple other verses. Hebrews 12:22 says, instead you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to myriads of angels in a festive gathering. Hebrews 12:22. Okay. And then Revelation 14:1 through 3. Then I looked, and there on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. So this is that remnant that Paul is referring to here, that will receive that fulfillment of the promises God made to them. And so as we move forward into verse 27, we find that God is faithful. He is a covenant keeper. And this is where Paul really comes with this final part of this verse that says, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And so Jeremiah 31 to 34 talks about this. Again, this is Paul connecting the dots here for us between the Old and the New Testament. 31 to 34. It says, look, the days are coming. This is the Lord's declaration, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. This one will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant they broke, even though I had married them, the Lord's declaration. Instead, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, the Lord's declaration. I will put my teaching within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will one teach his neighbor or brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them. This is the Lord's declaration. So this is the new covenant preached about by the prophet Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And this is this great mystery that Paul is revealing here, and how important it is to recognize that this is the gospel. This is God keeping his promises to not just Israel, but grafting in all of us and giving us that opportunity, but still keeping that promise to his chosen people, the Jews, while at the same time allowing others to enter in and receive the good news. And so these verses are really important for Paul to show. Paul was the one, the chosen instrument to take the good news to the Gentiles. And so, but being a Jew himself is really important for him to just let us know, how that covenant stands up for us in our time today. And so, in the practical applications, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for us today? And that question could be asked: has God failed Israel? And no, he has not failed Israel. And we found out, and in order to really understand that, we had to search the scriptures. And that's what we have to do. And we found out that no, God has not failed Israel at all. In fact, he has a perfect plan ready to release that hardening of their hearts in his perfect time and in his perfect way. And does God fail us? And the answer to that is no. And even as we look back to that story, and I know you have many, many stories where it seems like it's hard to understand what God's doing. And that was a one-day story of plans made and plans failed. But did the purposes and plans of God in the long term fail? Not at all. And so we know that we can trust God. And I think what does it change for us is that it changes how we can respond to trials. It changes how we live during the times that we're waiting. And if we think of Psalm 130 verse 5, it says, I wait for the Lord. My soul waits. And in his word, I put my hope. And so my hope is not in my circumstances and not in the daily stresses and the victories and the things that are going on in my life, but it's in his word that I can trust and that I can really count on. And he shows that here, even in the most difficult passages of scripture, the real heart of who we are as believers, of God offering salvation to us. God is faithful and keeps his promises. And so our takeaways from this, what does it look like for us to really be accountable as believers to why did Paul write this? Why was it so important for him to let the Gentiles know, don't be conceited about your salvation. Let gratitude spill up in you, pour out of you, gratitude for your salvation, that God would call you and offer you salvation. And so what that does for us is that gives us an urgency for the gospel because we're grateful for it. We recognize that we don't deserve it. Israel didn't deserve it, and neither do we. He says in Romans also, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so it gives us an urgency, and it also gives us a better and a greater amount of compassion for the unsaved. And so what that does is that allows that gratitude along with that compassion and urgency makes us bold like Paul was. It makes us bold, and it makes us have an undivided heart and mind. It really puts us on the one road that the reason I'm here is to make God's name known in whatever way that looks like, with my little children, with people in my community, with people where I work, whatever that looks like. It gives us and it instills in us a boldness that we have because we have received the gospel by grace, and we have an urgency to give testimony to that to the people around us. And Paul knew that was important to the Gentiles. He knew that they were going to need to understand this in order to endure and to persevere in all the trials that were going to come their way. as they served him. And it's the same for us. We needed to hear this too. And God knew that and inspired Paul to write this for us. And so as we close, I just want to ask you, what difference does that make for you day to day? What difference does that make for you in the amount of time and the amount of commitment that you put in to spending time in God's Word and knowing what it says so that you can impart it to others? What does the discipleship of your own life look like? What does the discipleship of others look like in your life? And how does this change the way you respond to trials and difficulties and wondering where God is and what He's doing? Do you go back into His Word where you find Him faithful? Do you go back into your circumstances and look back and see the patterns and the steps and the faithfulness of God? And that is my prayer for you today, that you would do that you would not be boastful, but that gratitude would spill up in you for the grace that you've received, and that you would walk it out with boldness and urgency and compassion and make His name known here at Chain of Love, with the children that are in your care, and wherever else He takes you beyond these walls. God bless you.